All right. Well, I think we may get started. I'm conscious of everyone's time. Kia ora koutou, called Jackson Tukuinga. My name is Jackson Rowland. I am the director of the Aotearoa New Zealand Stewardship Code, and welcome to the Stewardship Code Masterclass on investor engagement. These masterclasses are sessions that we run fairly regularly with the signatories of the Stewardship Code, and this is the first one that we're running that we're making open to the public. So I'm pleased that so many of you have registered and are joining this session. For those that aren't familiar with the Stewardship Code, it's a framework that's been created in New Zealand to guide investors on how to work with companies to navigate those companies through critical ESG risks to help them maximize that long-term value over time. The code was launched back in 2022 after 18 months of industry-led development, and we already across that time have managers of majority of the assets under management signed up, which reflects really strong adoption of stewardship practices in New Zealand, as well as really strong global activity in the stewardship space. Another indication of the growth of stewardship and the really strong adoption of that is that last year, RIA's Responsible Investment Benchmark report found that for the first time, corporate engagement and shareholder action was the most common responsible investment strategy, overtaking negative screens for that first year. That's just one example of that indicates that investors' behaviours really are changing as they look to be more actively involved in supporting the long-term success of their portfolios. But what does that involvement and engagement actually look like? How do investors work with those companies? That's exactly what today's webinar together provide tangible examples of what invest. What are the outcomes it can contribute to, particularly in a market as it's important that these engagements are constructive and effective, and hopefully this webinar will paint a clearer picture on what this looks like. To do this, I hope my internet's going okay. It looks like you're all still moving, so I hope I am too. To do this, I'm joined by some of New Zealand and Australia's experts in this area, who I'll introduce throughout this webinar. Before I get to that though, I just want to encourage you all to ask plenty of questions by using the Q&A function within this Zoom webinar, and we'll then make sure there's some time towards the end of the session to ask the panelists those questions. So, without further ado, I'd now like to introduce Richard Proudlove. Richard's the Director of Corporate Engagement at the Investors Group on Climate Change, or IGCC. Richard has really strong experience in collaborative investor engagement, including through Climate Action 100+. Richard's going to start us off today with a case study of Climate Action 100+, so we can better understand what the global collaborative engagement looks like. Welcome, Richard. I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And hopefully everyone can hear me. Oh, good. We're on the next slide. So thanks, Jackson. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm the Corporate Engagement Director for the Investor Group on Climate Change, or IGCC. And amongst other things, IGCC is one of 5 global founding partners, which you can see on this slide, that set up the global initiative Climate Action 100+ in 2017. CA100+, it's an investor-led corporate engagement initiative that facilitates collaborative investor engagement on climate change with the world's biggest corporate greenhouse gas emitters. So the initiative engages with 170 listed companies globally, and currently has around 700 investor signatories. And in Australia and New Zealand, we've got 60 of those signatories engaging with 14 of those companies. And the way it works is each company has a corresponding investor engagement group, typically around 5 to 15 investors, and 1 or 2 of those investors will be taking a lead investor role. So they have responsibility for bringing the group together annually to set engagement objectives, and then arranging engagement conversations with those companies, typically with fairly senior execs, such as the equivalent of the sustainability director and others, maybe the CFO and the investor relations person, for example. And so, yes, typically the cycle of events is the group will come together to agree engagement objectives and meet with the company post-disclosure, and there may be other meetings that come after the AGM. And if they're not seeing progress being made, they may escalate, and often this takes the form of a letter to the board. I should emphasize that our role as the founding partners is really just to administer these groups and provide analytical support. The investors' signatories are independent fiduciaries And so we don't seek or require collective decision making in respect to the equities they hold. And the initiative very much operates mindful of regulatory considerations in relation to acting in concert. Next slide, please. Oh, can we go to that next slide? Oh, great, fantastic. So I'll quickly mention that we also have something called the Net Zero Company Benchmark. Basically, it's a scorecard to evaluate each of the 170 focus companies, and those assessments are published annually around September, October. They're all done by the Transition Pathway Initiative based out of the London School of Economics. And really all you've got is 11 key indicators with sub-indicators, and the companies are assessed against each of these. And it's really just a starting point for the investors to think about, or where they might, set their engagement objectives. We certainly don't expect them to engage against all of the indicators, but it's essentially a reference point. It's also worth having a look at because it gives a sense of where investor interest lies. So the benchmark covers, for example, decarbonisation targets, transition planning, capital allocation, governance, policy alignment, disclosure, just transition, amongst other things. So worth a look. Next slide, please. I've included this case study. I'm actually have to respect anonymity, so I haven't named the company, but it's one of our oil and gas companies. Each engagement is different, really. So it's not typical, but it's useful to talk you through this because it gives a good sense of the scope of the engagements and maybe the sort of cadence. Way back in 2022, the engagement company had set engagement objectives and were meeting with the company on them setting a scope 3 target. There was a bit of concern around the degree to which offsets were included in their transition plan. And also the engagement group were flagging that capital allocation was very much focused on building the portfolio of fossil fuel assets rather than necessarily encouraging investment towards decarbonisation. And in fact, in that same year, the company had committed to a sound climate. So that's a non-binding management resolution asking for shareholder votes in relation to their transition plan. Only 50% of shareholders endorsed the plan. So 50% didn't endorse the plan. Actually, in terms of the sound climate, that was a bit of a global record in terms of lack of support. Following that AGM, based on the subsequent disclosure, the Investor Engagement Group actually felt that the company hadn't taken that feedback on board, so they couldn't see any material change to the company's targets or decarbonisation strategy. So they did, arranged a conversation and shared that with the company, but also submitted a letter to the board. So they're basically asking in that letter for enhanced disclosure around their decarbonisation strategy, their investment in new energy, and stronger disclosure around use of offsets. They're also asking for reduced reliance on offsets in their decarbonisation strategy, and they wanted more evidence of capital allocation in line with the global carbon budget. At the following AGM, actually, one of the engagement group members pre-declared that they weren't going to support re-election of one of the directors. That they did that as an independent fiduciary. It's notable because although it's sort of fairly common or more common in, say, the US market, it's not something that's it's not something that's common certainly in the Australian market. So there was a pre-declaration, and then again within that AGM, the voting in support of REM and the sort of director voting was lower than expected. So, and that was actually reported in the media as a bit of a climate backlash. So again, a bit of pressure on the company to do better. And so they committed to have another sound climate in 2024. And actually during that subsequent year, I think the company were very proactive in terms of reaching out to the Climate Action 100 Plus engagement group. I think they found it quite efficient and useful to have a representative group of investors in our market with whom to engage with. So again, there's a focus on scope 3 targets, greater clarity on the emissions pathway, especially post 2030, and disclosure on use of offsets. I will, just to complete the picture, say that they've just had their AGM again. Unfortunately, they had this that in their say on climate, they got an even worse result. So there was a bit of movement in terms of better disclosure on offsets and something around a commitment in terms of indirect value chain emissions, but not really quite a Scope 3 target. So the group is now convening on what to do next. I mean, sometimes we've had some success with, say, a company where we're pushing for a Scope 3 target, where we pushed for something that was a bit of an interim step towards a Scope 3 target around disclosing and providing milestones on working with customers on their on reducing those value chain emissions. So that might be something that the group looks into. Anyway, this is by way of example. So hopefully that's useful and gives a sense of how CA100 Plus works. And I'll hand back to Jackson.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Richard, for that example. It's a really good example, I think, that demonstrates a number of things, including the important influence that investors have and the, I think, quite strategic way they can use that across a number of different engagements with companies. When we think about engagement, it's not just one meeting, and there's a sequence of steps and escalations often that engagement involves. And so that was a really good example of that. Thank you. I'm now really pleased to welcome Lucy Cooper, a partner at Chapman Tripp. Lucy has recently prepared a legal opinion for the Stewardship Code, which aims to clarify how investors can collaboratively engage with each other in New Zealand without creating competition-related legal risks. You probably all heard the disclaimer that Richard shared in his presentation, and it's an important part of collaborative engagement, is that we need to make sure we do so within the competition laws of the respective market. Lucy is going to provide a brief overview of this legal opinion to help investors hopefully feel more confident in how they can undertake collaborative engagements here in New Zealand. Welcome, Lucy.
Thanks, Jackson. Hi, everyone. So we know that competition law risk is something that can be a real deterrent to collaborative engagement by investors. And that's partly why Jackson has approached us for the opinion. The reality is sometimes that's appropriate, but there are low risk scenarios as well. So as many of you will know, the most serious competition law or Commerce Act risk is around cartel provisions. And that's the risk that really deters people from collaborating. And it's the risk that it's appropriate that it deters people, or at least makes them cautious about collaborating, because it's a risk that is a criminal risk. And also the conduct, if you get involved in it, is it's unlawful regardless of whether it has any effect. So what we're trying to do, in our opinion, is really try and help people access that low risk conduct and feel confident about it. And then kind of on the flip side, having a sense for when there might be some real competition or risk concerns there, so that in those scenarios they can, kind of think harder or get advice. I should say, just since we're in the zone of disclaimers, the advice that we've done obviously covers competition or risk, doesn't cover things that the FMA or others might be interested in. So just to, I guess, cover that off, though it's probably obvious. So the main threshold question that I would invite you all to ask yourselves when you're thinking about investor collaboration is that first one of whether the collaboration involves competitors or potential competitors. So if you're wanting to collaborate, are the people you want to collaborate with in competition with you in some way? If they are, then that's when you do need to think harder about what you're doing together and whether that would breach the Commerce Act. But if you're not, that's when you're likely to have more leeway. So you can see we've got these three questions there, and they're all really important. But I guess the one for accessing the lower risk conduct is really the first one. And obviously we don't have much time today, so I think I'll focus on that first one. And if I can encourage you to do one thing, it's really familiarize yourself with scenarios where you would be considered competitors and where you wouldn't, because that's really key to getting comfortable with competition or risk. So what we think about when we ask ourselves, does the collaboration involve competitors or potential competitors, is do you have aligned incentives or are you competing with each other? And the key examples in the investor context would be if you are co-owners or you are both shareholders in the same company, you're not competing with each other in relation to what you are wanting that company to do. Your co-owners, you have aligned incentives. Where that gets tougher is if you are co-shareholders in a company, where you are buying or selling shares or a stake in that company, then you are in competition. You are potentially in competition with each other for that. So if I'm looking to sell my shares in a company, then other people who are looking to sell their shares in that company are in competition with me, and you need to be cautious about that. So for example, you can talk, like this is a very high level example, obviously, but if you are talking to your co-shareholders about companies meeting targets and all of those sorts of things, that's fine. You've got a mutual interest in making that company do the best it can. If you're deciding if the company does X or Y, then I'm going to sell my shares, and then agreeing with another shareholder to do that, or the timing of that, you may be in competition with each other there, and you could be tripping yourself up. So that's the kind of shareholder part. The other part where we think about competition is obviously competition between the underlying companies that you're investing in. So, two oil companies, for example, that compete in the same downstream markets, something along those lines. So again, if you are an investor investing in a company, you and the company are not in competition with each other. You are an owner of that company. But you might have shares in two oil companies, for example, that are in competition with each other. So you need to think about whether you are facilitating anything between those two companies, because they are in competition with each other. So that can arise where you have cross shareholdings in two companies, and a similar scenario can arise if you are talking to the shareholder of another oil company. So say you own shares in one oil company and investor B owns shares in another. You own a small part probably, but you own competitors. So you need to think about the upshot of that. Now, I think for these purposes, we might not go through the detail of questions 2 and 3. And I just really encourage you to focus on that first one. And then if you feel like you've tripped up that first one and you are wanting to do something that involves competitors, someone you're in competition with, or involves competing companies, then I'd encourage you to look through to the next questions and see if you are in a more complex situation, or if you can feel a bit freer about what you're doing.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucy, for making what is clearly very complex sound relatively simple. And I think for me, it was certainly really interesting to think more about that competition aspect and what situations are investors in competition with each other and what aren't. And certainly a takeaway for me is that in many instances, collaborative engagement is permissible within competition laws in New Zealand, and within the full opinion that I've shared in the link in the chat, there's a number of really great examples to support that. But certainly, when it comes to dealing with shares and things like that, you want to be particularly careful. So thank you, Lucy, for summarising that. Right, we are now going to transition into the panel aspect of today's conversation. Before we do, I just want to remind everyone to please make sure you add any questions that you may have into the Q&A function in the Zoom, and we'll make sure we get to them towards in a few questions' time. First, to kick us off, I'm going to introduce Ian Matheson and Rebecca Swan. Ian is the CEO of the Australasian Investor Relations Association, or AIRA, you may be more familiar with, whose mission is to advance the awareness of and best practice in investor relations in Australasia in order to achieve better outcomes for all capital market stakeholders through enhanced engagement. Rebecca Swan is also joining us, who is the Responsible Investment Advisor at Fisher Funds, one of New Zealand's largest investors and also a code signatory. Rebecca and Ian, I'm going to ask the first question to you both, actually. Now, what does a good engagement look like from both an investor perspective and also the company perspective? Rebecca, I might start with you from that investor side of things. What does a good engagement look like?
Great, thanks, Jackson, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Well, in our industry, we love a good acronym, so I've come up with one for this morning. ROT, R-O-T. So the R is for be respectful. So for many of the companies that we invest in, we've been shareholders for a really long time, circa 15 to 20 years, and we've built really strong relationships with management and boards. But we recognise that both parties are wanting to improve long-term value creation and mitigate potential risks. So it's really important that we engage with intent and respect, which brings me to the next letter, O, be organised. So I think it's really important to have a really clear engagement plan for the year. Of course, parts of it may carry over into future years because, as we know, engagement is not linear. And also some themes have a long-term focus, like climate change, or some have a short-term focus, like perhaps a REM review for directors. But of course, we know, as the old saying goes, that what gets measured gets done. So it's also really important to have a clear approach. So having engagement themes for the year, defining those, but then also defining what your engagement objectives are. And then within the engagement objectives, summarising what it is you want to achieve and what progress looks like for each of these objectives, which would then give you engagement milestones. So I guess, that point where you assess where you're at and what the next steps may be. But it's important to remember that not all engagements are created equal. So it's important also to have a view as to what point you may walk away if it's a bigger, more long-term topic. Coordination within being organised is also really important. So make sure you look at the company agenda for the year in terms of their time frame of communications with shareholders, and be respectful of this. So, think about what you're going to be doing at each stage throughout the cycle, pre-AGM, when sustainability reports are being released, and also being really mindful and strategic about your program of activities and with who and when you're engaging with. And the third letter, T, be targeted. Be really clear and transparent on your plan. Share with the company what your engagement themes are generally. Communicate well with your investment teams and give areas for them to focus on in each meeting, and also voting guidance where appropriate. And some engagement themes, of course, may go across business areas and contexts, so make sure you're talking to the right people. And also make sure that engagement isn't overwhelming, and make sure it's concise, give clear feedback and what your next steps will be. So that's Roch for you. I'll pass back to Jackson.
That is a great new acronym. I think it may be my favourite one. Thank you, Rebecca. Ian, I might pass to you now to share from the company perspective, because this is it's a conversation between two parties. And so what do the companies look for in a good engagement?
Thanks very much, Jackson, and good morning from me too to everyone. Look, just a few points from me from an issuer perspective. The first one is to try and avoid the them and us situation, which seems to still be all too prevalent when particularly large shareholders, asset owners or asset managers meet with companies, particularly if it is a collaboration. There's some of those approaches we hear are still run in such a way that there is this sort of them and us situation that seems to be in place. I'm reminded of more to that point. I'm reminded of some comments that one of your colleagues at T Corp in Sydney made at Financial Review ESG conference the other day. I'm referring to Alexis Chang, who's head of investment stewardship at T Corp. And she said, I think we need to understand and recognise that the journey to net zero is riddled with uncertainty. The data isn't certain, the pathways aren't certain, policies aren't certain, so we need to be a bit understanding about that. Obviously, there's more to stewardship and engagement than just climate. But given climate is such a lightning rod issue for so many investors and many companies, I thought that was worth repeating today, because I think that that echoes a lot of the sentiment that we hear from members, that is issuers, about the stridency from some quarters within the investment community when it comes to addressing the important issue of climate change. But obviously, everyone wants to see evidence of clear and short-term action. but it is a lot, as everyone would appreciate, particularly on this call. It is a long-term game. The second, just to repeat, importance of avoiding the them and us when it comes to engagements, and coupled with that, the importance of being seen and not just being seen, but in practice as well, being joined up. So that is the responsible investment team being joined up with the investment team. We still hear this complaint from issuers on a pretty regular basis as well. There's this perception amongst some companies that there's these parallel universes that operate when companies engage with the investment community, which may be engaging with the responsible investment team who say one thing, and then when it comes to engaging with the investment team, who recognizing that the investment team may also be an external investment team, an external investment team or teams. So just the importance of coordinating engagement approaches with your investment team and any external fund managers for that matter as well. That's the first point. The second one is please use the investor relations people where they exist within issuers. What we see and certainly encourage issuers to do, and many companies are now doing this, is combining investor relations with the corporate ESG function. And I'm deliberately using that term corporate ESG to capture the data, the reporting, and the engagement. That those three tasks or responsibilities are very much now, in particularly in larger companies, are moving into the finance function and either being combined with investor relations or sitting alongside investor relations. So those, if there is a separate corporate ESG person, you can be sure that person is either part of IR or works very closely with IR. So that's just a trend within how companies are responding to engagement requests and also wanting to front foot a lot of these issues as well. The third plea from issuers is in relation to data, and consistent with Alexis Chang's comment about the data isn't certain. One of the things that many issuers bemoan are just the constant requests for survey type requests that come in from data providers, but also individual investors and asset owners or fund managers in some cases as well, which are in many cases repetitive, and may just ask some of the same questions in different ways. I think everyone wants, both issuers and investors just want consistent data that's sort of clean and usable, and hopefully with the sustainability standards pretty much locked in now, that will enable better data. But wherever it is already available, please don't reinvent the wheel and ask for the same data, which is more often than not on the company's website, if not in the sustainability report. Those are the three points I wanted to stress in terms of good engagement from a company perspective. Jackson, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Those are great points, and I'd particularly also stress that them and us point. And I think in a market like New Zealand, most of us know each other outside of these circles. Also, the relationship side of things is really important. And research globally also shows that constructive engagements can be more effective. So the more we can work together, and bringing in Rebecca's respect point as well, hopefully the more effective these conversations will be. Rachel, I want to bring you in now. because this is starting to sound quite complex. I think we're starting to grasp the variety of nuances and considerations within an investor engagement. But at the same time, particularly in New Zealand, that investors here are very resource constrained. Rachel, as the head of responsible investment at Mint, and another code signatory, and also RIA's Aotearoa Collaborative Working Group co-chair, thinking about smaller asset managers, how do you balance this resource constraint, but also the importance of being involved in these engagements and contributing to those outcomes?
Well, thanks, Jackson. Atamaria, everyone. Ko Rachel Tinkler toku ingoa. I think the first point, Jackson, is when you are resource constrained, is that recognizing that you can't tackle everything. Beck stole one of my talking points, but for us, we draw up a program at the beginning of each year, or maybe 18 months if we think the issues are sort of longer running than that. And then we apply a materiality lens over it. So we're checking sort of what issues, what are the most topical and pressing issues that we think are present, and where are we going to get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of shifting our portfolio in a more positive direction on those specific issues. And so I guess the advantage of that is that you're focusing on the same issue across a range of companies over and over, and so you're upskilling yourself as you go. So each time you're looking at a different company, you are, applying the learnings that you had from the last engagement on the same topic with a different company, and you're already sort of on the front foot with the next engagement that you undertake. So like if we look at Mint's modern slavery work, for example, we did exactly that. We looked at the highest sectors that we are exposed to across the New Zealand market, compared that against the list of sectors where there's the highest exposure to modern slavery risk, and then the common sectors and company names across those became our targets. Then we leverage things like RIA's Human Rights Working Group has an investor toolkit. We leverage that. We joined Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking Asia Pacific, which is obviously focuses on these issues. So that gives us more access to resources and learnings. And then, like I said before, immediately once I'm looking through a company's modern slavery statement, if they have one, or their sustainability report, and their supplier code of conduct, straight away I'm picking up on things that are either good or not so good, and straight away I'm getting a list of things that I know I need to talk to the company about. So there's an efficiency there with sort of that repetitive work. And then another important point, so if we're thinking about you use an engagement program, you use a materiality approach, and then passion is the other thing. If you're passionate about pursuing an issue, then you're obviously going to find it easier to do that work and be more efficient about it. And it's okay to want to get wins on the board and follow those sort of passionate issues. Again, you've got to make sure that they're sort of more relevant for your portfolios and for the companies that you're talking to about them. But this is, as you mentioned, Jackson, this is a newer approach. The engagements, has only recently become the main approach, and so it's okay to want to get wins on the board, and pursuing issues that you're passionate about is going to help that. And then finally, just to Ian's points about the them and us, there is sort of that ongoing engagement with even, my investment colleagues. We had a conversation with a company, and at the end, my colleague said, "Oh, well, thanks for letting us, interrogate you on this." And I was like, "No, it's not an interrogation. It was a conversation." And the company thankfully said, "Oh, we didn't think it was an interrogation." So so I guess acknowledging that you are just having these conversations. We're doing a risk assessment to build a list of what we perceive as the risks this company is exposed to. We're taking that to the company and saying, "This is our perception. Do you agree or not?" And then we might have to walk back on some things, or the company can respond on certain things, and we can sort of think. Then we can reassess and go, "Oh, that risk might not be quite as high on the list as we thought." So very much a conversation, and a sort of constant adjustment of objectives along the way as well, and recognizing that that's okay and that's part of it.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Rachel. I think that prioritization point is so important, regardless of the size, right? No one can do everything, and considering that materiality and then layering in that passion piece, I really like as well, because certainly at times that passion is required to get through the process. But I think one of the things that's standing out to me is this all sounds a little different to the types of engagements we more commonly hear about in the media, which are sometimes those more activist approaches and asking for quite extreme or rapid and significant ask of a company. That's more commonly what we hear about, but this is sounding a little bit different. So Richard, I wondered if I could pass to you with that IGCC experience. How are these engagements that we're talking about today, how are they different to those more activist approaches we hear about in the media, and what's important about those differences?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jackson. So I think it really just builds on what we've already heard from the other panelists. So thinking about what Rebecca and Ian said about, good engagement. For example, Climate Action 100 Plus really seeks to build on and enhance the existing active stewardship and corporate engagement activities of institutional investors to help them better address the material financial risks and opportunities associated with climate change in their portfolios, rather than, say, an activist investor, which is typically acquiring equity in a particular entity in a targeted way with a specific agenda or outcome in mind. Although obviously CM100 Plus has this overarching goal of ensuring companies are aligning with net zero by 2050, the Paris goals, but again, noting Ian's point that each sector has a different pathway to achieve that. So we need to be mindful of that. So again, I think you mentioned, Jackson, investor-focused advocacy. It's often pushing for something quite dramatic, like divestment, whereas collaborative engagement, Climate Action 100 Plus, is more focused on fostering those long-term relationships between companies and their investors, so they can collaborate on achieving a fast and equitable transition in line with what's achievable in key sectors in the context of an overall, Paris-aligned outcome. And also noting Rachel points about investors and resource constraints, and actually the ever-increasing breadth of activities and demands in terms of active stewardship. So I think, I like to think that Climate Action 100 Plus is fostering a certain level of efficiency and reducing duplication, in that, the investor signatories to Climate Action 100 Plus are benefiting through sort of shared capacity building, and the companies themselves benefit from receiving a clear and consistent and consolidated expectations from a representative sample of the market, so they don't have to have multiple engagement meetings with multiple investment entities. Thanks.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's also making me think of the length of time, the nuances and the length of time that these engagements can take, because, again, working together across company cycles and things, this can take time. But I guess at the same time, we all have a sense of urgency around the challenges that the world is facing, the risks that portfolios face, and the passion that we have around these problems. So Rebecca, I wonder if I can go back to you, and considering this tension around the urgency, but the inevitable time this takes, what are the levers that investors have to, improve or accelerate the outcomes of these engagements?
Thanks, Jackson. I guess at the risk of not wanting to be too repetitive of what my other panelists have said, I think, as I said earlier, it's really important to acknowledge that engagements aren't linear, and there are obviously some things where you can have, get the runs on the board quite quickly, and there are other things that are going to take time. So when it comes to setting your engagement plan, you have to be realistic around, like what some of those themes are. But having a really clear framework gives you that solid governance foundation, which is really important. Obviously, when we engage with companies, we do it through the CEO or the C-suite. There's sort of 5 steps. There's that management, then there's the aspect with the board, and then the other part of stewardship is using our, our active role as an investor and in voting. So making sure that we are actively voting in all of our portfolios, whether they're active or passive, on shareholder resolutions. I guess where there is, Climate Action 100 is a great example of a collaborative engagement effort by investors, which is actually having an impact and is actually making progress. Other things that you can do is, collaboration other ways. Obviously, Rachel's given the example around the modern slavery, where a group of investors has come together in New Zealand around feedback on the legislation. But also one of the things that we do at Fisher Funds is we do have a collaboration partner that we use globally, and acknowledging, for a large investor like ourselves, and also the fact that we're based in New Zealand, it is harder to get time with some of these big corporates. And we know from when we did the engagement with the Crown entities around in the Christchurch mosque attacks, how hard it was to get those meetings, despite the large amount of AUM behind the initiative. So by collaborating with a party that does that aggregation and collective engagement on a group is a powerful way of dealing with these, I guess, sort of more, I won't say business as usual, but those often very common engagement themes that many investors do have across broader organizations. And then another way that you can, I guess, further that is, looking at shareholder proposals. So shareholders coming together as a group with other investors and industry bodies to, propose things to the company. But again, referring back to my Rosh, in a respectful manner, and working with like-minded investors is very important. So again, it's about finding that balance, ensuring that your engagement is productive. The engagement process is ongoing. It's not a one-to-one event. And effective shareholder engagement takes time and efforts from both sides. But as we know, the rewards can be significant for both investors, shareholders, and companies.
That's a great summary. Thanks, Rebecca. And I think it connects nicely to what Ian was saying around the company side of things. It's those perspectives are valuable from both the investors and the companies to bring into the engagement. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A coming through. Thank you for them. So I might just ask one more question to the panel before we go to some of the audience questions. And Rachel, I might come to you. We've mentioned a couple of times already the modern slavery oriented engagement and the policy focus of that. And I think today we've primarily spoken around investor and company engagements, but naturally investors have significant influence and expertise that are sometimes focused beyond just for the company, and policy is just one example of that. So I wondered if you're happy to talk a little bit more around that modern slavery engagement and why investors were so interested in that approach.
Yeah, thanks, Jackson. So for anyone who isn't aware, earlier this year, January, we got a group of investors together and wrote to the minister who was in charge of the modern slavery legislation, just to reiterate that we really wanted that legislation to be fit for purpose, and our overarching sort of aim was to get a due diligence requirement included in that. And I mean, we can talk on this for hours, but essentially that is something that is in line with best practice, and is what, as an investor, I'm already expecting companies to do. So I didn't sort of see there any benefit in the law not matching what investors are already talking to companies about and what expectation is there. So I certainly see investors very much having a crucial role to engage with policymakers, just as much as we're engaging with companies. To Ian's point, so if there's these systemic issues that are going on, we can't put the burden on one company to sort of lead the charge and lead the change if it's really a wider systemic issue that is causing these risks to be there. And with modern slavery, there's multiple issues that are sort of contributing to it being an issue. We need changes to the visa systems, we need changes to other pieces of legislation, we need better support for those who are exploited. But I guess if I look at the ecosystem of everything feeding into an issue, and then I look at what investors, where investors can play a part in improving that, policy changes are certainly an avenue that we can influence. So and it's not a one and done. I'm trying to do some more work at the moment to figure out what investors can do next to sort of try advance that further. There's still lots of work to do, but I think that was reflective of the fact that investors are are engaged across the board and not just with companies on a wider sort of basis.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the work you've done leading that, Rachel. And I think it's a really important example, as I say, that investors have influence and should be thinking about the various ways that they can use that influence, with companies being just one of them, particularly for the systemic portfolio-wide risks. All right, I'm now going to go to some of the audience questions. And just a reminder, feel free to please submit any questions that you have, and happy to ask the panelists those now. I'm going to attempt, Lucy, there's a lot of interest in this legal opinion, and I'm going to attempt to combine 3 questions into one, so good luck. But particularly around the Commerce Commission advice around collaborative engagement for sustainable outcomes. Wondering your observations around the implications of that advice for proxy voting, for the exchange of information, and also for investor confidence generally in, embracing sustainability initiatives.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of kind of proxy voting and sharing information among the investors in the same company, I think I'd kind of take you back to that first question, which is, in that scenario, you are co-investors, you're not in competition with each other. So discussions around voting in the same company from a Commerce Act perspective, so setting aside anything else, is actually kind of low risk, because that is just about how you jointly own your company. It's not about competition as such, if I'm understanding that question correctly.
Yeah, great. I think that's right. Any other kind of broader market observations following that ComCom guidance? Was there more inclination towards sustainability initiatives, or have you not really noticed a change yet?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I think there was a really wide range of reactions to that guidance. And one of the things, I guess, to bear in mind is that for the Commission to be much more open to collaboration than is conveyed in that guidance would probably require a law change. Like, as you know, the Commerce Commission is bound by the Commerce Act, just like we all are. And to my mind, it's true to say that some of that guidance is pretty, like, it kind of has a bet each way and doesn't always provide the level of certainty that people would like. And that is something that, legal advice can sort of advance, or your own understanding of what's going on. But equally, in a sense, there are limits to what they can facilitate, because, that's kind of the law. So I think I think it's more about people getting confident and comfortable with how the law operates, and some of the reaction to the Commerce Commission guidance reflects back into that question. Not to fully defend the Commerce Commission on everything they do, but it's tricky for them as well here, and we're all on the same sort of journey, I suppose, with figuring it all out. But hopefully the opinion takes it a little further in terms of just like practical steps for thinking through what is essentially the framework outlined in the guidance, and knowing where you can proceed kind of without worrying too much, and where you might need to take it a bit further and kind of get some advice.
Exactly. I think the Commerce Commission guidance doesn't give a lot of direct investment related examples, whereas this opinion gives a large number. So to that confidence point, we'd really encourage the audience to look at that opinion to get a better understanding of how those guidelines relate explicitly to investor engagement and collaborative investor engagement in particular. Thank you, Lucy. That's really helpful. Now I'm going to ask a question. I think maybe Richard, I might pass this one to you. Are you able to, kind of following on from what Bex was sharing towards the end there, can you talk a bit more about triggers or when you would either escalate an engagement issue or consider voting against resolutions or divesting? What are the triggers between those different thresholds?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, certainly with CR100 Plus, it is investor-led. So that's very much within the hands of the engagement group themselves. And, as a group, again, we have to kind of be mindful of group decisions around voting. So, typically the escalation path, as I mentioned, is often a letter, a behind the scenes letter. The next step might be a bit of media around that, but more broadly, we do, we'd like to encourage the investors individually themselves to have good escalation planning. Again, that's, not for our eyes, but, for the individual fiduciaries themselves to, to exercise internally. With resolutions, again, certainly in Australia, it's not a common thing for institutional investors to file resolutions, but we do. There are certain bodies that do, and we make, through the initiative, we make our investor signatories aware of those resolutions, again, without necessarily encouraging them to vote one way or the other. So, yeah, I can really speak to what's feasible within the bounds of the initiative that I facilitate. But again, I think the key point is then to for the investors themselves, hopefully they're following some of the, the good guidance around escalation planning themselves. I hope that answers the question. Again, it'd be interesting to actually get a response from a specific investor as well, I think.
Yeah, sure. I'll welcome Rebecca or Rachel if you'd like to add anything. I do note there's growing, I guess, guidance and examples around timelines, if you like, for engagements and those escalation milestones within that, which naturally these are complex and chaotic situations and so do vary and change throughout the process. But to be clear at the outset around here is what we're looking for and here is how we'll escalate it if that doesn't happen is important. But Rebecca, maybe I can pass to you to add to that.
Thanks, Jackson. I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier around with your engagement plan, having really clear objectives and milestones. So if you have that plan in place and you explain and document that really well, it kind of sets up that framework or decision-making process for you along the way. And of course, there's always extra things that pop up that you may need to consider. But it comes back to having that solid foundation, that framework to follow. And really taking the time to think about it. And it's a living, breathing document. Every time your engagement team meets or the investment team meets or ESG committee meets to discuss these things, to review what's changed, let's change, what's the milestone, what's the check-in point, etc. So just, like anything, that good, solid governance foundation really helps with these processes, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Thank you, Rebecca. Ian, I'm going to extend this conversation to you to bring in that company perspective, because as we're talking about escalation, we're also talking about respect. But naturally, this is where it gets challenging, right? To make sure we all maintain that respect, but also push things a little harder, which is the goal of the escalation. From the company's perspective, how should companies be preparing for this? When escalations are taking place, how do they prepare for that? And I guess approach that, and potentially even what are realistic expectations for investors in this process, just to make sure that those relationships are maintained. Things are pushed, but the respect is still there, and the relationship is there at the end of the day.
Yeah, like I suppose, Jackson, that depends a bit on what the issue is, and the support amongst the shareholders for particular pathways that they want companies to pursue, and how that fits with the company's strategy as well. So there's probably no one size fits all here in terms of how an escalation will be approached. Suffice it to say, I think it's fair to say most companies are responsive, will be responsive, particularly if the majority of their issued capital is pushing for change on a particular front. That said, I just addressed your question, Jackson. I just, as the conversation's been unfolding, it occurred to me with collaborations and that are not uncommon these days on more than just climate, although Climate Action 100 is a good example. To the extent that investors may not be part of those collaborations, through your organisation, this initiative, is there any way that notes are kept of those collaborations so that others are aware of what is already in train or what is already being discussed with companies on particular issues? And I'm conscious there's always free riders in many aspects of life, including engagement. But again, consistent with one of my earlier comments about repetition, if the big collaborations particularly are able to publicise the fact that to non-participants in those collaborations that here are the issues, and part of the obligation is probably for companies to respond as well publicly to issues that are raised. But depending on the approach, and some of the engagement, as everyone knows, is better dealt with behind closed doors without publicity associated with it. But anyway, that's my question back to you, Jackson. Is there any attempt at keeping notes, apart from private notes, but publicly making available notes particularly for other investors, so that they can see what's on the agenda and what's being pursued, so that to avoid the repetition of others having to get involved as well?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and certainly something I think is important to manage the resourcing for both investors and also companies. No one wants the same question being asked from multiple different sources. Step one to get there, I think, is increased transparency in the market from investors. And now I know that these are sensitive topics, and so not everything can be disclosed, but where it's appropriate to disclose, I think we should encourage that. And because these are constructive, positive conversations and leading to outcomes, let's share that. And then step two, the stewardship code, and I'm sure others could look at collating some of that data and making that available so it's clearer in the market what engagements are happening. I'm conscious of time, and we do want to wrap this up in a couple of minutes, but Rebecca, I'll pass to you first.
Actually, go to Richard first, because I feel like he's just going to add something on to that is relevant, and then I'll go.
Yeah, so just practically in terms of what we actually do. So within CA100 Plus, each engagement group has a documented engagement plan which outlines the engagement objectives for the year. So within CA100 Plus, each region asks for permission to share those with all signatories within that region. So where that permission is granted and engagement groups feel comfortable, and which is most of them actually, we are sharing that with the broader signature group for that market. So hopefully that goes some way, Ian, towards addressing what you're pointing out. For those outside of CA100 Plus, they don't get that. But again, I think hopefully through the net zero company benchmark, noting that a certain degree of pragmatism is required in interpreting those results in terms of where a company should be right now on the trajectory to net zero. Hopefully that benchmark is consolidating and highlighting some of the areas where engagement might be fruitful.
Thanks, Richard. Go for it, Rebecca.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add, and without stating the obvious, I just wanted to highlight a point, and that's, obviously investor groups like CA100 Plus is a great example of collaborative engagement. And if you think about the inverse of what we've talked about today, the inverse is if we don't do it this way, and it is an activist approach, and it isn't done in an organised, respectful, targeted way, then what we actually create is usually destroying shareholder value. So at the end of the day, we're all collective shareholders in these companies. Some we might be engaging with, some companies that we don't own, but it's about maintaining that long-term value creation and not destroying shareholder value. So that's just an important point I just wanted to state.
Very important point and perfect note to end on, I think. That it's a very nice way to wrap this up, and this is all about, how do we maximize and enable that long-term value and manage some really important environmental and social risks along the way. Thank you very, very much to everyone that's joined, and particularly to the panelists for the insights that you've shared today. I will not be forgetting the acronym ROT. Thank you for creating that, Rebecca. And you know, some of the sentiments that came out around prioritization, I think, is really important. The constructive nature of engagement as opposed to the them and us. I think there's a number of really, really helpful thoughts and ideas that have come out of this conversation. This webinar is being recorded, so we will make this available on the Stewardship Code website in case you'd like to re-watch, and certainly for those that have missed today. And if you have any questions more generally around stewardship and investor engagements, do feel free to contact the Stewardship Code via our website, stewardshipcode.nz. Thank you very much again, the panelists and the attendees. I hope you all have a very good rest of your day. Ka kite.